So a big welcome back to the Resources Conservation and Recycling webinar program. As always, I'm your host today, Mitchell Jones. I'm the Outreach Editor at Resources Conservation and Recycling. A big welcome to everyone. Thank you all for being with us today. Before we kick things off, just a couple of quick notes on the program itself, a little bit of information for those who are interested in the program and how it's operating. So this particular program is the English language program, webinar program of our journal, Resources Conservation and Recycling. We also have a Chinese language webinar program if anyone is interested in that. Now, this particular program is based around the scope of the journal. So you can expect to see webinars on any given topic that would fit the journal scope. So the full breadth of the journal scope without any particular bias or preference for a specific research area or topical theme. The one thing that we do like to do is to run accessible webinars. So we do ask our speakers to take into consideration when they're planning and preparing their presentation, the audience that might be attending, and that there could well be people within that audience who maybe they are, wanting to learn something about an adjacent research area. They maybe have heard things about an adjacent research area, or they're interested in other research areas. But they don't necessarily know, they know their research area, they know the basics of other research areas, but they may not be experts, so to speak. So we do try to run a program where non-expert audiences are also able to take something away from it. And in order to do that, we basically ask that speakers are not really using too much subject-specific jargon, that they're including some introductory content to their research area before they're going into the specifics of their article that was published in the journal. Now, registration for the program is necessary if you would like to participate in the Zoom environment where you currently find ourselves now. So you can register using the links that are provided in the newsletter, the Resources Conservation and Recycling newsletter that is circulated at the end of each month. You can also find those links on the social media pages. So if you go to the Resources Conservation and Recycling X page or Facebook page or LinkedIn page, you will also find the links there. We are posting them there for you. We also have them on the journal homepage. So if you go to the Resources Conservation and Recycling journal homepage from Elsevier and you go to the About tab and then to Webinar Calendar, you will find the registration links for the events there, in addition to the archived content. So all of our webinars to date are listed there, archived there, with links to their YouTube pages for the existing content. So all of the content that we are presenting is presented also live streamed on YouTube. So if you prefer YouTube rather than Zoom, you can find it there also. But not only is it live streamed to YouTube, it's also archived to YouTube. So if you want to see any of the existing videos, you can just go to youtube.com/@RCR journal. And that's really everything, except to say that we do really appreciate feedback on our program. We do strive to improve it and make it a better match with what you hope to get out of this webinar program. So if you would like to leave any comments and just simply answer a few questions, we do really appreciate your time. At the end of the webinar, you will be provided with a survey. It will automatically open when you close the webinar. It's just 8 questions, and it will only take a couple of minutes of your time. So if you would be so good as to fill that out, we do really appreciate it. We take your comments seriously and do endeavor to implement them as best we can. Okay, so I will kick things off now by just bringing up the, click here, by bringing up the event program for today, which is right here. So we've had the welcome address. I'm going to briefly introduce the journal. I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Katrien. Very lucky to have Katrien with us today. Then I'm going to provide a few brief notes on the administration side of things. We're going to have a 20-minute presentation followed by about 10 minutes of question time, flexible there if you have any questions. And then we're going to touch on the information on the next event and have the closing remarks. So the journal you're probably all familiar with, Resources Conservation and Recycling. It's an Elsevier journal. The scope is, I think, well represented in the name, Resources Conservation and Recycling. We're really interested in systems-wide strategies, technological, economic, institutional, and policy focus, resource management practices, conservation, recycling, and resource substitution, resource productivity improvement, restructuring of production and consumption profiles, and transformation of industry. If you have any great quality research in those areas, be sure to send it our way. In terms of today and all of our programs, we ask that communication be in English. It's just to have a common bridging language so that everybody can understand each other. We have closed captions available for anybody who perhaps would like to watch the webinar without audio, or perhaps English is not their first language and they might benefit from some captions. They are available both in Zoom and also on YouTube. If you have any questions, feel very free to post them in the Q&A over the course of the presentation. That's the whole point of us having a webinar rather than something like a podcast or something like that, is so that you have the opportunity to actually get involved with the event in that way. Be sure also to upvote any questions that you think might be, that seem good questions to you, or that you might potentially have also asked. We also have the option of you directly asking your question using your camera or your microphone, or both. So you just need to indicate that you would like to do that by using the raise hand reaction in your toolbar, and we will gladly bring you onto the floor to talk to Katrien. Yes, if we have time, we will have time. We will make time. Our speaker for today, very lucky to have with us Katrien STEENMANS from the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. She's going to be speaking with us on the topic of broadening the research agenda, circular economy, and private law. So Katrien is a postdoctoral researcher on the project Circular Supply Chains, Identifying and Allocating Legal Risks at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She was previously assistant professor at Coventry University, UK, and has also held positions at King's College London, University College London, the University of Surrey, EDF Trading, the Urban Land Institute, and the European Environment Agency. And Katrien's research areas include waste law, circular economy, industrial symbiosis, and the role of property rights within waste law. So a big welcome to Katrien. Thank you so much for being with us today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that you're able to do so.
Great. Yeah. Hi, thank you for that introduction. So the title of my talk today is Broadening the Research Agenda, Circular Economy, and Private Law. This talk builds on a paper that I wrote together with Wiebe Ulfbeck and was published in the journal last year. If you only take away about 4 things from this webinar, I hope it's the following 4 things. First, it's that public law currently dominates circular economy discussions and implementations. And because it's not resulting in the scale and the speed of circular economy transitions needed, we need more focus on private law implications. Part of this focus needs to be mapping private law opportunities for supporting the circular economy. And then finally, I conclude with a call for research by listing a few suggested research questions on private law changes needed to move away from the linear economy. I won't delve into the definition of the circular economy beyond to state that I use it to describe the concept where its primary purpose is to reduce resource usage and to prevent waste generation, and only where that is unavoidable, that waste is reused, recycled, or recovered. This is based on Kircher and others' definition. And if you want to find out more about his definition, then I highly recommend that you listen to last week's webinar that's available on YouTube, where he discusses his seminal 2017 paper with other authors and the updates to it. You'll also then hear that I've just done what his paper did not set out to do, which was introduce a 115th definition, but that is what I've done. It's widely recognized that a transition is needed to a circular economy in order to address the myriad of challenges facing the world today. Yet it's not happening at the speed or scale needed, and there are even studies that evidence that the circularity gap, the so-called circularity gap, is growing. And this is where law and policy have a role to play in that they can support further implementations that hopefully can then happen at the speed and scale needed. So where are we currently at in relation to circular economy and the law? Together with Fjell Lesniuska, we describe the legal landscape of circular economy and the law as comprising of three different categories. First, there are those explicitly labeled as circular economy laws. Examples of these are listed in the box. Even though Japan and South Korea don't use the term circular economy in the title, Ascend Material Cycle Society and resources circulation, if you look at the legal definition, it's very similar to the legal definitions adopted of circular economy in the other acts in the box as well. Then there are those laws underpinning circular economy principles. And these vary in that they aren't explicitly labeled circular economy, but for example, in their objective may have this law is being implemented to help support transitions to a circular economy, or it may be that they support the principles that form part of the concept. So for example, if they focus on reducing resource use or minimizing waste generation or encouraging reuse. So for example, there's container deposit schemes or informative labels for consumers to know about, for example, the recycled content within products they're purchasing or the durability of their products. And then the final category is the laws impacting circular economy. Currently, environmental law dominates the circular economy legal landscape. The explicitly labeled circular economy laws are often recognized as being within the realm of environmental law and specifically waste and resource management law. Similarly, with many of the laws and the measures underpinning the principles, again, these are often found in environmental law. So this category is to acknowledge that the circular economy requires a system-wide change and systems-wide transition. So it is unsurprising, therefore, that it impacts lots of different areas of law. And this is being increasingly recognized. For example, if we consider right to repair laws that are being introduced in some countries, these have acknowledgement of the challenges that intellectual property law poses to right to repair. Then if we look at the types of tools found across these various types of laws, on the right-hand side of the slide, the text is a bit small, but the purpose isn't for you to read all the measures that exist, but to showcase some of the measures I identified in a review of law and policy measures that exist to address plastics pollution. And when you delve into these many different measures that exist, and whether these are predominantly public or private law, we find that most of them are public law. And what we mean by public law is the governance of relationships between public entities and private entities, where public entities are, for example, national governments, local authorities, international governance bodies, and then private entities are individual citizens and businesses. And then private law governs relationships between private entities, so between individual citizens or between businesses. So if we pick any of these measures on the right-hand side, for example, targets are set often by national governments in relation to waste recycling targets, for example, for specific sectors to achieve. Informative measures such as labeling or certification schemes on products, again, are imposed by the government on businesses. So many of these measures, even though they can also be implemented in a way that is governed by private law, predominantly fall within public law currently. And this is where the gap is. And the focus of the remainder of my presentation will now focus on making the case for why we should consider private law as well, and why it needs to be much more towards the forefront. And the way I do this is by using the example of extended producer responsibility as just one of the many measures that exist. So what is extended producer responsibility? And my background is a legal scholar, so we do like starting out by always setting out definitions in order to identify what is and isn't covered by what we discuss. So what is extended producer responsibility? At its essence, EPR, as it's also known for short, implements the polluter pays principle, which is a very common principle used within environmental law at international, EU, and national levels, for example, that patently mean that the polluter should pay for any environmental damage or damage to human health caused by them. And EPR implements this principle by placing responsibility for the management of products throughout their life cycle on the producer of the products. The type of responsibility can vary, but generally, the way Lindqvist introduced it, options include financial responsibility, informative responsibility, physical responsibility, or liability. Physical responsibility is where the producer is involved in physical end-of-life management of products and/or their effects through development of technology or provision of services. Often this is, for example, through take-back programs. Financial responsibility is where a producer covers all or part of the costs, either directly or through a special fee to organizations called producer responsibility organizations for managing the wastes at the product's end of life, for example, for covering the costs of collection, processing, and disposal. Informative responsibility is where the producer is required to provide information on the product and its environmental effects throughout its various life cycle stages, such as the polluting effects of producing the product or the polluting effects of waste produced. Liability is where the responsibility for environmental damages caused by a product is borne by the producer. And again, this may occur at any life cycle stage. And then finally, I've also listed organizational responsibility on the slide. And this is because the EU's Waste Framework Directive has mentioned or mentions organizational responsibility in its amended Waste Framework Directive. The directive doesn't define it, but my understanding of reading the article is that it's essentially the organization of these other types of responsibility. And the rationale for having one or multiple types of these responsibilities is that by making the producer responsible for the waste that their products produce, there will be an incentive to focus on the design and material content of their products, so have a so-called upstream impact, as well ensure that any waste that is generated is dealt with in an environmentally sound manner, so a so-called downstream EPR. And the way it can be implemented is in two different ways, either in individual producer responsibility schemes where the producer is responsible for their own products, or, and this is often the more popular way that it is being implemented, is through collective producer responsibility. And this is where producers can join these producer responsibility organizations to meet their legislative requirements. It's generally a well-known and widely accepted mechanism. WWF and EAP in 2020 estimated there were about more than 400 EPR schemes implemented around the world. And some countries like Japan and certain EU member states implemented EPR schemes more than 20 years ago, whereas other countries like Kenya are poised to adopt their EPR regulations anytime. As with any concept and measure, there are limitations to it. First, its impact has been limited. There's also been a predominant focus on financial and informative responsibility, whereas it's often thought that physical responsibility and liability would have the more systemic or cause the more systemic changes. Part of the reason is that the way that financial and informative responsibility are currently implemented is that it doesn't result in achieving waste minimization, but it essentially creates another market for waste. And in this way, it actually incentivizes the continued production of waste rather than incentivizing its minimization. But despite these limitations, because of the potential benefits it can result in, it remains a very acknowledged and viable mechanism, or potentially viable mechanism, to contribute towards a sustainable future. It just comes with the usual caveat that exists with most legal measures to address waste and resource management, that it isn't a silver bullet. It needs to be implemented together with other measures. So, EPR and private law. Many of the mandatory implementations of extended producer responsibility across the world are as a result of national laws and policies found within the public law realm. For example, with the EU, it's found the EU Waste Framework Directive, which is how nation member states should implement certain measures. So how does private law feature? At its essence, EPR is only possible as a result of property rights and duties that underpin EPR schemes. These property rights can either incentivize or inhibit EPR. For example, with physical responsibility, if it's implemented as a leasing scheme, the only reason such a leasing scheme can currently exist in current systems is because the producer retains certain ownership rights. If we consider take-back schemes, then there are questions about how it is going to be implemented, whether it is implemented with the producer retaining certain ownership rights, and then whether the consumer can choose when to return products, or whether there are certain duties that should be imposed on a consumer as to when they should return the product to the producer. Then, for example, consumer protection law, another private law example, relates to the rights and duties of consumers in relation to EPR. So this again then links back to, if it's, for example, physical EPR, then what are their rights and duties in relation to the product that they have or may own? To operationalize EPR, contract law also is likely involved. If a producer is part of a producer responsibility organization, then more often than not, there will be a contract in place that sets out the terms of the contract between the producer and the producer responsibility organization in order to essentially ensure that these organizations meet the legal EPR requirements that the producer is required to meet. Even within individual EPR schemes, it depends on the particular EPR scheme, but it's likely that there may be certain contracts, for example, in physical responsibility with waste management facilities to help manage the waste, or in informative EPR, there are questions surrounding information that's provided to consumers. Is this part of the contractual term of a sale of goods? There's also company law, which is relevant to the role of the producer's company's management and stakeholders in implementing EPR schemes. Or a final example is tort law, If EPR is implemented in terms of liability, then there may be product liability implications of EPR or impacts of goods being used in secondary markets as a result of EPR schemes. So hopefully that's clarified that private law does have a role to play in EPR schemes. It is just not yet reflected in the understanding often, or at least the explicit understanding of EPR schemes, as is reflected in the literature and in surveys I've undertaken with stakeholders. This is only, again, it's not the intention that you read all the small text on the slide, but it's to highlight a research project I'm part of, in which we're researching the legal risks of EPR. And I'm happy to discuss the results in more detail in the Q&A session or be emailed about it afterwards. But essentially, as part of the project, I've examined the extent to which contract law in relation to legal risks of EPR are considered. And in a review of more than 130 articles that mentioned legal dimensions of EPR, contract law was only mentioned once, even though contract law is essentially a fundamental piece of collective responsibility schemes, and in many individual EPR schemes will also have a role. And the single mention was in relation to regulatory risk, in that contractual arrangements were identified as an opportunity to address some of the challenges posed by the regulatory risks of laws and policies changing in unpredictable and unanticipated ways. I then followed up with a survey that was essentially conducted as a closed interview with 32 stakeholders, and within these responses, there were only 2 mentions of contract law issues. First, that there is a risk of a contracting party not fulfilling its duties, and second, that negotiating contracts is with external providers takes a long time. So there is some acknowledgement, but very limited acknowledgement of a fundamental dimension of EPR schemes, and that is just contract law. There are other areas of private law, as we saw on the previous slide. This means that contract issues are not on the radar, and this could be either because it's not an issue, or it could be because it's an unexplored avenue, which provides either opportunities or challenges in relation to EPR. And this is, again, surprising because even though it's introduced as a public law tool, it is implemented through private relationships. So hopefully that has clarified why private law has a role to play within measures that can help these or support these transitions to a circular economy. So what sort of questions need to be explored? And here are just some initial suggestions. Questions at this early stage take quite a basic form. How do various areas of private law affect a circular economy? There needs to be an understanding of this first. And then how are various areas of private law affected by a circular economy? Which private law tools can be used to implement a circular economy? What are the opportunities, barriers, and challenges of private law tools that are or can be used for circular economy transitions? What are the complementary areas between private and public law? Who are the stakeholders affected by private law for the purposes of circular economy, and so on? And then perhaps the most fundamental and basic, but most challenging question is, does private law fundamentally need to change in order to facilitate a circular economy? Private law is arguably embeds the current linear economic system, for example, by facilitating the commodification of resources and waste. So should the way private law works be changed? If so, how do we go changing the fundamentals of private law systems? So there's lots of research avenues still to be explored, which is good news for private lawyers. So hopefully this webinar has held true to its promise of highlighting that public law dominates current circular economy discussions and implementations. There is scope for much more focus on private law implications of the circular economy, and that as part of this focus, we need to map the opportunities as well as the challenges of private law, and that generally there is a call for more research on the changes needed to private law to move away from the linear economy to the circular economy. That brings me to a close. Thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Katrien, for such an interesting presentation, and really on a topic that I know nothing about at all, but that everybody wants to know about, because it really is the keystone for almost everything, right? It all comes down to the legal ramifications. I was sort of thinking as you were talking that a lot of the time in the circular economy and transition in recycling reform and all kinds of circular economy things, extended producer warranty, all that responsibility, all those sorts of things that you talked about, it always comes down to this question of who's responsible, right? Who's going to be the responsible party? Because nobody wants to be that responsible party, you know, because it's normally expensive for the companies, or it's, you know, you're the bad guy legally, or nobody wants that, right? So, but it is something that I think a lot of people pin that when they're thinking about a solution. They are, a lot of people are sort of not necessarily palming it off onto other people, but it always comes down to, that's for the governing bodies to sort, right? This is often something that happens. Sorry, just to interject here. If this is the question time now, so if anybody has any questions, feel very free to ask. I'm just wanted to ask a couple of things myself first. The first thing I wanted to ask you, Katrien, was just sort of thinking a little bit more broadly speaking about law and circular economy. It seems to me that some aspects of circular economy, or some themes or topics within circular economy, seem to be better represented legally than others. Maybe you could provide some insight for somebody that has absolutely no idea about this. Which kind of topics are more legally represented, which are less legally represented, and perhaps why is it that is the case? Because for somebody who doesn't know anything about it, I intuitively kind of think, oh, well, you've got things like plastic pollution and recycling, things like that are better legally represented because it's what voters care about. And quite often, you know, people who are making policies care what the public sentiment is. So I don't know, maybe you can just shed some light on what is well legally represented, what isn't well legally represented, and why.
Yes. So there's a few things to pick up there. Certain sectors receive better legal or more legal focus, in part because, as you recognize, there's more public focus on that. And I'm a researcher based in Northwestern Europe, so my view is very, the laws I'm most familiar with are those EU laws. But in England, for example, a decade ago, David Attenborough really started highlighting plastic pollution in certain documentaries that were being made, that then became really highlighted in mainstream media. And this is also then an easier issue to solve, where single-use plastics are one of the key foci. And that's a clear issue that action can be taken on. And if there's a clear issue, then it's at least not necessarily easier to pass regulation, but to target regulation. And that's why single-use plastics suddenly, and within the EU as well, gained a lot of attention. Whereas, for example, and often the comparison is with climate change, where climate change is such a complex issue, and the reason it's harder to govern is because the issues are so complex. Whereas with waste and resource management, the focus seems to be on one sort of resource, one type of waste, and that's what the focus is. Then that's the sector dimension of it. Then there's also measures that are more, again, the public, the consumers have a role to play. If we think about the options within the waste hierarchy that exist of first trying to reduce our waste generation through reducing our resource use, up until then recycling, recovery, and disposal. Disposal and recovery in a way are, again, easier to regulate because the way that this is done is, for example, through landfill taxes and so on. Whereas having resource use minimized requires the consumer also to make changes. And then it becomes a question of how do we nudge consumers to change their behavior? And often the mechanisms that are most effective, like financial mechanisms, like introducing taxes on consumers or producers, are also the least popular. So it just often where there's more regulation is also because they're the lower hanging fruits that are either easier to pass, quicker to pass, easier to understand, and a combination of all those factors combined.
It's actually that sort of almost brings me on to my follow-up question, as it were. So because you're talking about how these sorts of changes are achieved. So I was sort of thinking, obviously we've got different legal processes in different countries. And I was sort of wondering, is there any, in terms of differences between countries, are there any sort of standout cases of countries that have legal systems that are better suited to passing these kinds of things, or worse suited to passing these sorts of in circular economy or environmental focused policies? So, for example, I mean, we're both in the EU, but not necessarily all of the viewers are. Quite a lot of the viewers will be viewing from America and Canada and also some other countries. So maybe you can provide some insight just about how these legal processes work, broadly speaking, between different countries, whether there are particular countries using particular processes that are better suited to passing these policies, or ones that are hindering it, why, these kinds of things. Yeah.
I read a great paper that wasn't case study specific, but was more generally on it. And its argument was, if you had dictatorship, those are the easier processes to get something through the regulatory system, because there's there's no stakeholder consultations, and it means there's less opposition. So if you had a benevolent, environmentally minded dictator, that is the most efficient way to have a legal system put in place that is environmentally friendly. But in terms of comparing actual existing case studies, there's not really a standout country or approach that I can think of, because it is always so context dependent.
How are we doing in the EU?
Hard to say good or bad, but there is progress happening, and that is true for many countries around the world. At the moment, my research looks quite a bit at the Global Plastics Treaty that's being negotiated at the moment. And in going through a lot of the measures that are being implemented, in any part of the world, lots of countries are taking action. It just depends on what's most suited to a particular context. And the EU, for example, has been so single-use plastics focused. But China, when we talk about circular economy laws, they're often seen as one of the front runners, because they had one of the first explicitly labeled circular economy laws. But as we saw, Japan, South Korea, they also had that early legal focus on the circular economy.
So what is China's law about then, for example? So you said the EU one is very single use plastics orientated. What is the Chinese one orientated towards?
Well, what I will say about these the explicitly labeled circular economy laws, and the EU doesn't actually have one that's explicitly labeled, but the Waste Framework Directive that governs waste management within the EU, one of its objectives is in order to facilitate circular economy transitions. They are, and this is a limitation of the circular economy concept, they are quite broad because the circular economy concept also tries to achieve so much. So what a lot of these laws do, and same with the law in China, is they provide broader frameworks to encourage predominantly recycling. There is that shift slowly happening that it's moving away from recycling to reuse, but legal systems are notoriously slow and take a while to respond, and having to draft and redraft and consult and then pass. But the focus tends to be on how can we, here are an option of measures that we recommend, please implement them, for example, at local authority level in order to encourage more recycling and avoid waste being sent to landfills.
Yeah. You know, you've also beautifully led again into my next question there, because you were saying that it can take a while, right? So I was thinking, as somebody who has this broad perspective on this, you know, an expert in this research area, maybe you can provide some historic context in terms of, you said, for example, Japan is come a very long way, and Kenya is now, for example, reaching a point where it's going to start to implement things. So looking then chronologically, historically, what kind of time frame does it generally take for a country to be able to change or to achieve some kind of legal framework for this kind of circular economy or environmentally focused legal framework?
Again, and this is the issue with law often, is that it depends. So within the EU, when action was taken on single-use plastics, that passed quite quickly. And I think it is in part because there was such public focus on it. So the EU was keen to show that they were making some movements. Whereas in Kenya, the proposed EPR regulations have undergone, I can't remember by heart the exact date when the consultation started, but there have been about 6 iterations of these regulations since 2018. And I think it's also in part to do with the complexity of setting up certain systems that will keep working. These are foundational systems that are then new to certain contexts. And again, it comes down to the subject matter. It's easier to implement a target, and it may not be popular, but easier to implement a target that says we need to recycle 30% of this type of resource by 2030 than setting up a full extended producer responsibility system where you have to identify, as you started the Q&A session with, who is the responsible producer, especially at a time where, you know, it's often not just one producer that feeds into a product, but lots of component parts. How do we allocate that responsibility? So it just depends on the nature of the measure and the complexity of it.
So how ambitious it is, and how perhaps also how well defined it is, because you've said, you know, setting a number on something, you know, 30% or whatever is perhaps not so, you know, without any necessarily having a structured plan as to what you're going to do to achieve that. You might have some broad ideas. The other thing that popped into my mind was, and it was something you touched on a little bit in your presentation. So historically, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, I feel that if there is some cost associated with doing things the right way. So it's always going to be cheaper to pollute or to create things without having much regard for the environmental impact of what you're producing. How can countries make their, well, not necessarily how, because I suppose the obvious answer is tariffs, but how easy is it for countries to make environmentally friendly or circular economy products more competitive on the market against these products, which evidently are going to always be cheaper to make?
Yes, that is the tricky bit, and there we again go into the realms of what's popular in lawmaking and what's not, and that it will often be more costly to implement these circular systems at the start. Setting up these deposit refund systems of containers is expensive, and then once they are set up, it can become self-sufficient, and that then there's a deposit being paid that is then returned and so on. So once these systems are established, it's perhaps more appealing, but that initial barrier of getting it implemented is tricky. And that's also why often financial measures are such a focus, by imposing landfill taxes so that landfill becomes hopefully a less appealing option compared to recycling. But then this is still tricky because, as we've seen with the plastic levies or charges on single-use plastic bags, often if a cost is imposed, there's that initial behavior change, but the tax or the charge or the levy needs to continually increase in order to keep the consumers to keep, so that they continue to stick to that changed behavior, and they don't just start seeing it as an additional cost again. So it's expensive to implement changes and then also to maintain the changes, which then makes it less appealing. So we could shift much more quickly to circular economy if we made huge taxes on the amount of waste people produced. If you were charged per kilo of waste you produced as an individual, you might start thinking much more quickly about the waste you're putting in your bin. But that wouldn't be very popular, and in the time legislation takes to pass through governments and so on, it would probably be scrapped.
That's always a tricky thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then maybe a final point, just allowing you a broad moment to make a comment if you would like to. Do you have any recommendations? Like, what if you could do something, if you could change something, what would you change? What would be your recommendations if you had any?
Oh, that's a tricky one. In my research, my focus at the moment is more dominantly about how social dimensions need to be much more at the forefront, that if the focus is less so on the economic and environmental dimensions, but focusing on equity issues of, about all the detrimental impacts of some of these commodification of waste and resources rules have on civil society, that maybe there may be a faster change happening, but it's a hard sell. But that would be the change I'd want, is to bring social dimensions really to the forefront, because the economic and environmental arguments haven't quite been strong enough. So we should try the social arguments much more, in the hope that that then causes the systemic shift needed.
I like that perspective, right? It's nice to, and it comes back to that first point again, right? Who's responsible? We are all responsible, really. So it does need to be a social thing. Well, it's very easy to hand the responsibility to someone else, isn't it? But we all have to do our part to make things happen. Thank you so much, Katrien, for your presentation. It was absolutely lovely. I found it very interesting because, as I say, I don't know anything about this, but you always think about it because it does touch everything. So in that case, I will share my screen again to just touch on the the closing remarks. So I should note that this particular webinar was a week early. Thank you very much, Katrien, for being so accommodating there. And so we will actually not have webinars in the early part of March. The next webinar will in fact be on March the 28th at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, so the same time on Thursday, the 28th of March. We're going to be joined by Camilla Krich from Norwegian University of Science and Technology. She's going to be speaking with us on evaluating the current Norwegian clothing system and a circular alternative. So we can all look forward to that. Please be sure to tune in then on March the 28th. So I'll again thank you so much, Katrien, for your presentation and for coming. Thank you again so much, and good luck with your research.
Thank you.